with gratitude that the Centre benefits from core funding from the Terra Foundation for American Art. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the staff at the Research Forum who are making these virtual events possible, particularly Dr. Fern Inch and Dr. Ocasio Finbow. I also need to explain that once Dr. Emily Warner, our speaker, has given her lecture, there'll be an opportunity for 10 minutes or so of questions. When we get to that stage, I'll ask you to use the raise hand function that Zoom provides if you'd like to ask a question, and then we'll come to you in series. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Emily Warner, our speaker this evening. Emily Warner is a historian of American and modern art whose research has been published in Archives of American Art, Art Journal, and by Tate, and has been supported by grants and awards from the Smithsonian American Art Museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Daedalus Foundation, amongst others. Emily's held positions at Vassar College and University College London, and has most recently been Tyson Postdoctoral Scholar at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. She's currently at work on a book entitled Abstraction Unframed, Abstract Murals at Mid-Century, from which the present talk is drawn. So her lecture tonight is titled Ornament and Obsolescence, Lee Krasner's Mosaics for Wall Street. So I'm now going to pass over to Emily.
Thank you so much, David, for that really kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here virtually at the Center for American Art. In the almost 2 years that I've been based here in London, the Center here at the Courtauld has been such an important resource for me as an Americanist through its programming and events. So it's really a special honor to be presenting my own research here today in this forum. I also want to extend my thanks to the Research Forum staff who've been incredibly helpful in getting the technical aspects of this flowing smoothly. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I really look forward to sharing this research and to hearing your feedback in our Q&A. Sitting atop the entryway to 2 Broadway, an office tower in Lower Manhattan, Lee Krasner's 1959 mural offers a study in contrasts. Against the smoothness of the glass and aluminum facade, the mosaic mural is all texture and tactility, its surface made up of thousands of closely spaced, irregularly fractured tesserae. Against the building's rectilinearity, the right angles, boxed massing, repeating entrance pillars, and tediously gridded surface, the mural explodes with splintered forms, craggy edges, and swooping ovoid shapes. And against the building's narrow palette of drab blue, tan, and aluminum, which you see in the period photograph at left, the mural is a veritable cornucopia of high saturation color, with earth greens, deep blues, bright crimsons, black, and small hints of yellow gold. Perhaps the biggest contrast is between the rote repetition in the building and the mural's dense variety. Every square inch teems with mutable and adjacent colors, forms, and textures. An area of plant-like spikes and folds at the mural's far left splinters into an array of different olive, earth, and cadmium greens. A nearby expanse is a jostling spectrum of different shades of blue. A brownish gray cement, the mosaic's mortar, visibly laces itself through the entire mural, forming rivulets and borders around each irregular mosaic tile, from the small to the minuscule, from rounded ovals to jagged triangles and rhomboids. For the post-war viewer, Krasner's mural was a ribbon of dynamic form and color in a sea of dull, gridded gray. The 86-foot-long mosaic by abstract expressionist painter Lee Krasner and her nephew Ronald Stein still stands today, although framed now by a striped green facade rather than the original grid of grays and whites. The building was resurfaced in the 1990s, and so in some of the detailed shots you'll see today, you'll see some of that more recent green border framing the mural, which you can try to visually delete and replace with the original facade. The mosaic was part of a wave of muralism in the 1950s, as abstract painters teamed up with architects and developers who were remaking the skylines of major American cities, New York especially. Largely forgotten today, this boom in abstract muralism comprised a rich field of artists, from the gestural painters of the Sam Coots Gallery, to European and Bauhaus-trained artists, to geometric painters who had been pursuing architectural commissions for years. Framing this diverse field was a consistent claim about abstraction's humanistic efficacy, its ability in large-scale murals to inject energy, warmth, and vitality into a regimented and empty world. And this is actually part of a much larger discourse in this period about art's humanism, its ability to soften the edges of the modern world, sometimes figured as austere modern architecture, at other times as the soullessness of the corporation, or even as the drabness of the city itself. It becomes practically boilerplate in the criticism of the 50s to describe not just abstract painting, but also sculpture, corporate art collections, craft and decoration, a whole host of visual and artistic interventions as warm and human, as sort of the touch of the hand or the individual that will warm up a cold, machine-produced world. And we'll certainly see some of that today in the period literature that I quote about Krasner's work. But what I'm hoping to do is to probe a little bit deeper into the meanings and implications of that language, of those claims, and in particular to look at what they mean for a work like Krasner's mural, large-scale abstraction installed as a form of architectural ornament and designed as a kind of public address, essentially abstraction that engages the pedestrian moving through the urban environment. The wave of abstract murals in the mid and late 1950s represents both a continuation and a departure. As a continuation, it builds on a much longer trajectory of abstract mural production, dating back to the 1930s, in which painters turned to muralism as a means of making a more immersive, complex, and pervasive form of abstract art, one that could be integrated into the spatial drama of architecture and the social habits of daily life. Across the mid-century decades, that is from the mid-1930s onwards, abstract artists and the architects they worked with used utopian language to describe how their murals would restore wholeness and integrity to aesthetic experience, and even to sort of human experience more broadly. By the mid and late 1950s, however, this utopian language begins to falter. And this is where the mural wave I'm talking about today represents something of a departure. Institutionally, twin post-war booms in the art market and in construction meant there was suddenly a plethora of resources, eager patrons, easy money, plenty of wall space to match muralist ambitions. This was accompanied by a proliferation of middlemen, agents, dealers, and marketers in the art world, figures who acted as intermediaries between artists, architects, and building developers in an increasingly complex landscape. And within this landscape, contrast emerged as a key term, both aesthetically and in critical reception. Abstract murals like Krasner's were understood in contrast to the buildings that framed or enclosed them, and also implicitly in contrast to social life itself in 1950s America. Today, I'll examine Krasner's 1959 mural in detail, looking closely at the work itself, and then moving on to a consideration of 2 Broadway, whose entrance it decorated, an edifice that served as an archetype of the post-war speculative office building. The relationship between Krasner's mural and its building allows us to explore the possibilities and pitfalls for abstraction as a form of address within the changing terrain of the post-war city, and also to assess how the aesthetic ideals of modernism assumed a new character in this moment. Krasner's mosaics for 2 Broadway, she made 2, one for the main entrance facade, which you're looking at here, and another one above the back entrance on Broad Street, are her only realized mural commissions, but they were not her first foray into the genre. As a young painter in her 30s, fresh from her studies with Hans Hofmann, Krasner designed several murals that show her navigating the fertile world of New York abstraction around 1940, absorbing and redeploying the geometric, cubist, and organic currents of the time. None of these murals was ever realized for a variety of reasons, but they allowed her to think through the spatial and architectural implications of large-scale abstraction. Later in the decade, as a more established artist and part of the abstract expressionist group, Krasner experimented with mosaic, creating 2 tables for her home in Springs, Long Island. Using the iron rims of old wagon wheels for the overall structure, Krasner filled the tabletops with mosaic tiles, broken glass, coins, jewelry, pebbles, shells, and other objects. She showed one of these tables in 1948 at the Bertha Schaefer Gallery in New York, where it attracted a good deal of attention in the press. Krasner worked on the mural for 2 Broadway from fall 1957 through spring 1959, a period of both personal loss and major growth in her career, following the death of her husband, Jackson Pollock, in 1956, and also her emergence in wider critical recognition as a serious abstract painter in her own right, with important exhibitions across the second half of the 1950s. The mural commission itself came through B.H. Friedman, a longtime friend and art critic, who was then still employed at his day job as vice president of Uris Brothers, the real estate company that developed and built the 2 Broadway structure. Krasner enlisted the assistance of her nephew, artist Ronald Stein, and worked with Vincent Foscato, a New York mosaicist who had also executed murals for Hans Hofmann and other painters moving into the mosaic medium. Union regulations prevented Krasner and Stein from handling the mosaic pieces directly, which they found frustrating. Instead, they supplied detailed sketches and maquettes to Foscato's studio and also supervised the breaking and laying out of the mural tesserae. The artist insisted on an unusual process. Instead of having the workmen grid, score, and cut the glass sheets into neat cubes, they had them shatter them with a hammer into irregular, jagged pieces. This handling gives the work its density of form and variation, as well as its signature texture, which you get a feel for here in these detail shots. It also relates the work to the collage paintings that Krasner made in the early and mid-1950s, just before turning to the mosaic, which likewise depend on creative destruction, the breaking down of pieces and their subsequent reassembling into new forms. Installed over the large doors that mark the entryway to the building, the mural unfurls across 86 feet, a continuous expanse that is visually divided into 4 segments by the entrance pillars. And I'm showing you here, along with the mosaic, a smaller maquette because it helps give a sense of that larger unbroken composition. Recurring ovoid forms structure the work. Near the center, for example, 4 curving strips of black, blue, and green here together form a dominating oval that stretches from top to bottom edge. Further along, just to right of center, a black pointed oval dives toward the mural's lower boundary like a bird or dolphin, while above it 2 ovoid plumes of red point skyward. In the far right section, a 2-toned oval in black and green bumps up against other forms in blue and black. And these ovals are spread throughout the work. It's a little bit hard to see them in some of the photographs that I'm showing you, but they're the most consistent formal trope. And they're really kind of the formal engine of the work, pulling your eye across the length of the mural. The use of ovals and twisted ovoids is familiar from Krasner's collages. Large canvases such as Milkweed, Blue Level, and Bald Eagle that she showed in her 1955 solo exhibition at the Stable Gallery. Together with torn vertical strips and painted lines and spatter, the hulking ovals of the collages frequently suggest views onto the natural world, reed stalks and bobbing flowers, for example, or in other cases, fragments of torn triangles and half circles that suggest a shrieking animal energy or the bubbling entropy of plant matter. Reviewing the collages in 1955, artist and critic Fairfield Porter was reminded of a, quote, messed up beach of pebbles, deeming the works like nature photographs, magnified. Krasner's art, he concludes, which seems to be about nature, instead of making the spectator aware of a grand design, makes him aware of a subtle disorder greater than he might otherwise have thought possible, end quote. This sense of a subtle, pervasive disorder is heightened even further in the mural, where allusions to the natural world are more numerous, but also more dispersed, lacking the bounding frame and sense of orientation that we have in the collage canvases. The mural instead is a horizontal ribbon of proliferating details and disorienting changes in scale and direction. We glimpse broad leaves and spiky branches and a patch of folded greens, the density and variety of a flower bud and a passage of myriad glistening reds, the surface richness of rivers or ocean and the complex swaths of blues and blacks. Tiny daubs and rods of yellow glint out at the viewer like the underside of a wing or the sun hitting a leaf. And all of these passages continually generate new shapes and motifs in seemingly all directions. The spiky greens send the eye up, but also down into the sides, throwing off a range of echoing triangles. The arcing and twisted ovals that we tracked across the surface compete with diagonal fins and wings and other forms. Where the collages suggest views onto nature, the mural immerses us within its chaotic currents, its fragments constantly merging into other far more abstracted forms. The mosaic medium also adds a new heft and tactility to Krasner's abstracted natural world. For all its formal dynamism, the mural has a petrified quality to it. All these glimpses of movement and underbrush and details locked into place. The mosaic tiles are glass, but their matte surface and jagged edges give them a stony, flinty quality. It is as though the organic themes of the collages have been transformed into an earthy, geologic register. From this perspective, the concrete fissures and craggy shapes of the mosaic recall not just plant and animal forms, but also mineral ones. Crystals forming deep below the surface, pointed stalactites, aerial views of dry, cracked earth. Or perhaps we were operating at an even grander scale, the geologic one of riverbeds and chasms and shifting topographies. Such evocations, cracked earth, geologic strata, tectonic plates, suggest a different temporality, especially when compared with the glassy sheen of the building's facade that surrounds the mosaic. Where the building seems to repel all traces, the mosaic holds a sense of extended time within it, both thematically in these geologic references and also materially, its crags and breaks and rivulets, marks of the process that created it. So far, I've been describing the details of Krasner's mural and their relation to the larger 260-meter expanse. But in practice, viewing the mural is actually kind of difficult. Depending on the weather and time of day, it can be quite a frustrating experience. One of the main formal techniques of the mural is the tension between an overarching propulsive movement across the surface and the chaos of details that undermines this. This complex relation of part to whole and part to part invites a gaze that moves towards and away from the work, constantly toggling between two very different scales. But the mural's size and placement make such mobile viewing difficult, far enough away to see the horizontal rhythm, and the energy of the splintering, multiplying details is invisible, close enough to get lost in the mosaic's earthy density, and the larger composition starts to fade away. It's also placed high enough that as a viewer, you have to stand with your head tilted back to even perceive some of these details. And on sunny days, a lot of the texture is obscured by the reflection of light. Now, interestingly, these problems don't really get noted in the period literature at all. One friend even wrote to Krasner, quote, "It's quite an experience to see the mural from afar and come up closer and closer until you're right on top of it," end quote, suggesting that some of that mobile viewing, that change in scale and position, could and did register. Another friend, Charlotte Park, commented on the texture in particular, again suggesting that under at least certain conditions, it was a visible and potent part of the experience. She wrote, quote, "The break of the glass and its various unexpected textures gave great interest to a slow-paced perusal." To the degree that it is difficult to view the work, this might reflect Krasner's relative lack of experience with architectural commissions on the scale they required. Her previous work in mosaic was largely for tables that could be physically approached and touched, and she may not have accurately gauged the effects of distance and movement on the viewer. But this problem might also speak to the very different aims of the mural's artist and the mural's patrons. That is, to their different visions for what abstraction, what art itself could do for and in buildings. To begin to explore that question, namely, what is the aim, what is the function of abstract muralism in architecture, I want to take now a closer look at the history of the building and its site. An extended consideration of 2 Broadway is curiously absent from the scholarship on Krasner's mural. This is curious because 2 Broadway wasn't just any ordinary building. It was a flashpoint for debates about how speculative real estate and a certain kind of unimaginative architecture that corresponded to it was remaking Manhattan in the post-war world, and indeed remaking modern urban life more broadly. Before construction began on 2 Broadway in 1957, the plot was the site of George B. Post's Produce Exchange Building, an arcaded structure in red brick and terracotta facing Bowling Green in Lower Manhattan. The ghost of the former building haunts much of the commentary on its replacement throughout the 50s and early 60s. The Daily News, for example, featured the site in its New York's Changing Scene column, with comparative photos of the entrance to the older building and to the new skyscraper with its, quote, startling mural. The Produce Exchange had its origins in the produce markets of colonial New Amsterdam. By 1861, it had organized as an official exchange, and by the 1880s, when it commissioned the building from Post, it was processing millions of dollars in orders for wheat, corn, petroleum, and other commodities, and had the largest membership of any stock exchange in the United States. By the 1950s, though, the building was too expensive for upkeep. A complex series of real estate negotiations ensued. One plan from 1953 called for a building by architect William Lescaz on the site. But ultimately, in 1957, the exchange leased the plot to developer Uris Brothers, who razed the brick building and erected 2 Broadway, to a design by Emery Roth and Sons, their frequent collaborator. Emery Roth was the builder of offices in post-war New York. In the 2 decades after the war, they put up 28 million square feet of office space in Manhattan alone. Characteristically, their design for 2 Broadway filled the zoning envelope to the maximum extent, yielding an additional 200,000 square feet of rentable space when compared with the earlier design that I mentioned by Lescaz. In the architectural press, news of the older building's coming demolition spurred numerous articles and photo essays, with critics like Talbot Hamlin asking if New Yorkers were, quote, such slaves to economic pressures that they can have no say in what they see, no power to preserve what they love. Meanwhile, in the business and real estate worlds, the new tower was hailed as part of the, quote, most ingenious real estate transaction of the year, and its various amenities, from air conditioning to quantity of floor space to enormous glass curtain wall, were trumpeted as the latest in office design. But architecture critics remained uniformly unimpressed by the new structure. Douglas Haskell's scathing critique for Architectural Forum was typical. Haskell saw 2 Broadway as part of a disconcerting trend, what he called the, quote, quick return, low-cost rental office building that had invaded Midtown Manhattan over the last few years and was now infiltrating Wall Street, filling Lower Manhattan with, quote, light, glassy, and steely surfaces. In a previous era, Haskell noted, New York's financial institutions were heavy and stony, modeled on Rome. If over-pretentious, they at least were composed, with stone carved and molded to catch the sun, and details carefully scaled to the new skyscraper height. 2 Broadway, by contrast, had none of these virtues. It was not composed at all. Rather, Haskell asserted, its form was entirely dictated by the need to maximize interior rentable space, which created a hulking facade on Broadway, and from the rear, a confused massing of what he called quadrangular prisms piled together. Its details, meanwhile, had no relation to scale or environment. The endlessly repeated aluminum framing elements fail to articulate either a vertical or horizontal emphasis. Quote, there is no such thing as a definite, strongly willed final shape, Haskell noted, but simply an endless play with a set of themes, ultimately creating an effect, quote, not unlike a great piece of magnified and glass-filled chainmail. But most egregious for Haskell was the siting of this uncomposed, poorly scaled, poorly detailed building. It was situated not on a modest background street, but instead at a site of great spatial drama, the canyon of Broadway that cleaved lower Manhattan in two and lent a sense of spectacle and power to the older skyscrapers that rose around it. And Haskell illustrates this point in his article by emphasizing the ferryboat approach to lower Manhattan from the river, in which Broadway serves as this inviting canyon opening into the city, pulling the viewer inward with the skyscrapers rising up on either side. Now, I think the question facing Haskell and facing us is, what can a mural do in and for such a building? Haskell has described a structure with no real form or shape, whose appearance is entirely dictated by the needs of rent extraction. The edifice has essentially zero interest in expression, in articulating a legible shape to the passerby, in communicating something of the business activity taking place inside, in suggesting anything about the changing form of the city or how new architecture should relate to it. And although we sometimes think of abstraction as an art form that doesn't communicate either, or that has an esoteric and difficult relationship to communication, to the representation of a recognizable world, the great accomplishment of abstract muralism over the preceding decades, over the 30s, 40s, and early 50s, was precisely in finding a way to give abstraction a more concrete and accessible meaning. It did this by marrying abstraction to muralism, by expanding abstract forms over the surfaces of buildings and the interiors of rooms, and thus linking abstract forms to the spatial unfolding of architecture itself. So one question that Krasner's mural poses very acutely is, can abstraction serve as an allied art to architecture when the terms of architecture have changed so dramatically? Or put another way, can abstract art still be a form of ornament when the usual role of ornament, to condense and explain architectural form, to mediate between building and viewer, is so alien to a project like 2 Broadway? Critics offered a variety of answers to these questions. For his part, Haskell saw the mural as a great relief, the one gesture towards meaning or significance in a building otherwise devoid of it completely. He ended his review by writing, quote, "In view of the criticisms voiced above, it is a pleasure to report that, through the efforts of Uris's B.H. Friedman, a distinguished mosaic mural by artists Lee Krasner and Ronald Stein will be placed over the entrance. If we cannot have good modern buildings," he intimates, "perhaps we can at least have good modern art to distinguish their entrances." But not everyone felt so sanguine about this trade-off. New York Times critic Ada Louise Huxtable, in a well-known article titled "Art and Architecture: New Terms of an Old Alliance," reserved particular disdain for those commercial builders that, quote, "splash art ostentatiously in entrances where it shows, after every conceivable corner has been cut where it doesn't show. While this may dazzle a gullible public," she noted, "it cannot redeem a shoddy structure. Art cannot be applied to a building rubber stamp fashion." She illustrates her point here with reference to an unnamed building, which I think we must take to be 2 Broadway, writing, quote, "One of New York's largest new offices, at a distinguished address, adds an ill-considered mosaic to a distressingly fussy curtain wall, neither of which does anything to define or clarify the building's monumental scale." From Huxtable's perspective, whatever distinguished note the artwork brings, it fails at its most basic architectural task, to aid in the expression of the building. It is nothing more than a cynical gambit on the part of the architects who rubber stamp the work onto the facade in a quick bid for prestige. 2 further essays, both published in the months after the mural was installed, hone in on this problem in particular, and I'd like to spend the time left exploring their arguments. Penned by B.H. Friedman and Leslie Katz, respectively, they take opposite views on the mural's merits, but both interpret the work in strikingly similar language, relating it to the city's history and its future, and to the forces of capitalism remaking New York in the post-war years. Let's begin with Friedman's essay, Manhattan Mosaic, which ran in Craft Horizons in 1959 and is much quoted and cited in the literature on the Krasner mural. As you may recall, Friedman was a Uris Brothers executive and close friend of Krasner and responsible for the mural commission. Completely unsurprisingly, he is far less critical than others of the two Broadway edifice that his company has recently financed, describing it as, quote, expressive of lightness, openness, transparency, almost nudity. And yet he's also relatively honest about the building's shortcomings, describing the edifice as, quote, a vast mass of a 32-story building, occupying an outsized 307-foot block front on Broadway, which he adds is more than 50% larger than a typical avenue block front. The, quote, prefabricated curtain wall construction gives the building a rigid austerity. All of this is quite different, Friedman notes, from the old Produce Exchange building, which, like other writers, he spends several lines describing, dwelling on its 13 large arches, symbolizing the 13 colonies, the various terracotta reliefs of pigs, cows, and wheat, and the Italianate turret. What the new two Broadway lacks, Friedman argues, is precisely, quote, the interest of the ornamentation and texture of the old red brick building and the effects upon it of time itself. For, he adds, even time, the weathering and character-giving friend of undistinguished architecture, cannot help aluminum and glass. It is here that Krasner's mural comes into the picture. The mosaic takes the outsized mass of the facade, Friedman writes, and, quote, contends with it, relieves it, makes it human. The planned freedom of the mosaic, with its variety of size, shape, and edge, is the opposite of the building's rigid austerity. Friedman gives the mosaic a pivotal role in the new building, implying that it realizes something of the texture and ornament of the old Produce Exchange that once stood on the same site. In this view, the mosaic's flinty matte effect, its range of colors, and its tactile surface echo what the former building offered through its warm red tone and the shadows and modeling of brick and terracotta. Time does not imprint modern buildings like 2 Broadway with signs of its passage, Friedman comments. Indeed, as I noted earlier, this is one of the central contrasts between the earthy, fragmented mosaic and the glassy facade that surrounds it. Friedman notes this in the absence notes this absence of temporality in the building on a material level when he describes the nudity and transparency of the glass and metal, but it's also there in his essay more subtly as a broader historical phenomenon, since the arrival of 2 Broadway means the destruction of a continuity of financial exchange going back decades, as well as of a building whose every detail was couched in historical reference and symbolism. Krasner's mosaic, in Friedman's telling, becomes akin to the masonry shell of the old Produce Exchange, hard, enduring, weathered, and with a natural capacity for fulfilling the decorative and communicative role of ornament. Amid a sea of mute, mass-produced glass and aluminum, the mosaic becomes the building's sole link to time and to history. 5 months after Friedman's article, the author and publisher Leslie Katz penned an obituary for the old Produce Exchange that grappled with these same central issues. To my knowledge, Katz's article is unknown in Krasner scholarship. It's not mentioned in any of the studies of the mural that I've seen. Contrasting the grandeur of the old edifice with its glass and aluminum replacement, Katz begins with an evocative description of the older building's features, comparing its tiers of arches to Roman aqueducts, and detailing the ribbons of terracotta sculpture and plaques at each level. Like Friedman, he is struck by the building's color, a, quote, rich, deep-hued, intrinsic red that became more beautiful with the years. And like Haskell, the architecture critic I quoted earlier, Katz discusses the structure within its urban environment. Quote, when twilight from the harbor flooded Battery Place, he writes, the Produce Exchange seemed to emit a beneficent answering glow, charged with a resplendent consciousness, a pagan, capitalistic altar place of meats and provisions, a temple of agricultural commerce. It was, he declares, a building you could have a feeling about. Your eyes could repair to rest upon it, contemplate it from Bowling Green. The building gave you a sense of relation to place and moment, a gratified significance to your feelings about the city, the struggle of the city, yourself as a part of the city. The Produce Exchange had civic meaning as a Greek or Renaissance structure. For Katz, the produce exchange was an expressive and meaningful monument within its downtown locale, giving form not only to the financial proceedings of its occupants, but also to the complex social and civic relationships, both spatial and temporal, both place and moment, of the city. In the essay, Katz insists he's not opposed in principle to the produce exchange's destruction, a thing of commerce the building had become uneconomic by the 1950s. And perhaps, he allows himself, the new 2 Broadway will be a modern phoenix, a fresh magnificence supplanting an earlier glory, aluminum and glass taking the place of brick and terracotta as the steam engine outmoded the sail. But such hopes are quickly dashed as Katz surveys the new structure. Hardly a building, he laments. 2 Broadway is more an installation, a package, a broad box encased in shiny wrapping, sheer, sharp, and gleaming. He continues, quote, designed purely in terms of economic function, it has been conceived not at all in terms of its location, but rather as a mere container for maximum floor space. Its, quote, outside shape and afterthought. The resulting effect is somehow both empty and assertive, soulless and aggressive. The striking edifice presents an essentially anonymous and faceless personality. Its overall effect is one of unmitigated self-assertion, negating everything in sight but itself, a glittering non-entity. And here, Katz trains his sights on Krasner's mural. As a gesture of art and decorative daring, he writes, the facade is glorified and enshrined at its entranceway by a large, wide, abstract mosaic, an innocuous arabesque of round and jagged colored shapes, constructed of fragments of Venetian glass, expressly shattered for the purpose. Like the building, this mosaic is committed to nothing beyond the mystique and logic of its own specialized abstract function as a thing apart, a law unto itself, a disrelation. For Katz, Krasner's mural follows the same logic as the building it decorates. Just as 2 Broadway is designed, quote, purely in terms of economic function, the mural is a form of pure art, so committed to its own mystique and specialized function that it has no relationship to the world around it, no point of entry, no source of basic intelligibility for the viewer like Katz, who gazes up at it from the street. Like the building, the mural too thus appears contextless. It is a thing apart, a law unto itself, a disrelation. And also like the building, the mural manages to be both too little and too much, empty of meaning, but destroying what lies around it. He calls the mural innocuous and trivial, but also a daring gesture, and later in the essay, part of the rapacious and calloused introversion of the modern world. Katz concludes his essay by turning explicitly to the themes of endurance and ephemerality. He notes that the fortress walls of the produce exchange had to be demolished with pneumatic drills. It was a structure built to last with the consciousness of the past and a respect for the future. When the flimsy 2 Broadway meets its end, he muses, quote, perhaps the only tool needed will be a beer can opener. Made for pure economic and art world ends, the building and the mural typify for Katz the modern age, one, quote, tyrannized by growth, obsolescence, and quick turnover. So is Katz right here? Is Krasner's mural of a piece with 2 Broadway itself, narrowly specialized, purely abstract, without expressive meaning or intelligibility? The mosaic actually makes an interesting case study for abstract art as a visual analog to the abstraction of capital, especially in the dynamic market of post-war speculative real estate. As architectural historian Reinhold Martin has argued, office buildings such as 2 Broadway adopted gridded plans and curtain walls in order to meet new demands for flexibility and endless rearrangement of interior floor plans. These buildings thus internalize the volatility and unpredictability of the real estate market in their structure and appearance. We might view Krasner's mural in similar terms. Its swooping abstract forms perhaps reflect not so much the natural world or a personal artistic vision, but speculation itself, prizing volatility, dynamism and flexibility. Seen in this light, the mural is far from being the building's saving grace, as it was for Haskell, a refined note over the entrance, or its link to a sense of time and history, as it was for Friedman. Instead, it doubles down on the building's essential emptiness, using the freedom of abstract art to pursue an essentially trivial, if formally dynamic, project. Now, there's some interesting supporting evidence for this reading when we look at the distribution of abstract murals in the post-war city. One particularly popular place for such murals, for such commissions, was in the lobbies and entranceways of speculative office buildings. Edifices like 2 Broadway, conceived of as real estate deals for rent extraction. At 711 3rd Avenue, an early structure in 3rd Avenue's post-war Renaissance, an abstract mosaic by Hans Hofmann was installed wrapping the elevator banks. At 111 West 40th Street, now 5 Bryant Park, an important building in 6th Avenue's post-war construction boom, Max Spivak's abstract mosaic framed the entrance. For 750 3rd Avenue, which I'm not showing you here, but was another Emery Roth building, David Hare's abstract mural in low relief covered a large wall in the lobby, and I could add many other examples. William Kaufman, the real estate developer who paid for Hoffman's elevator mural at 711 3rd Avenue, the work that you see in the center of the slide here, explained this trend, commenting in an article, quote, "It costs so little to have something outstanding. I'm amazed more spec builders don't go in for it." And Kaufman was largely right. The 2-dimensional mural was a very cost-effective venture. At 2 Broadway, Uris paid about $25,000, a little over 0.5% of the building's $40 million cost, for the design and manufacture of Krasner's mural. Such murals could easily be presented in press materials as another office space amenity, like air conditioning or automatic elevators, that buildings presented to their prospective clients. Such murals were also useful for generating press coverage, as newspapers devoted lines not only to the building's groundbreaking, but also to the unveiling of the lobby artwork. And most importantly, abstraction, with its patterns, repetitions, and non-referential imagery, was very easy to slot into existing building designs without making substantive changes. Applied to the facade or to a particular wall or elevator bank in one concentrated area, this nod to aesthetics was far less expensive than more pervasive architectural interventions, which could have altered construction schedules and eaten up valuable floor space. Now, abstract murals were also popular, it's worth noting, in the lobbies of what one critic referred to as upper middle class buildings, edifices somewhere between the lowly rental office building on the one hand and prestige headquarters on the other. The murals by Fritz Glarner and Josef Albers for the Time Life building are a good example of this. I want to pause here to emphasize this trend because it's a phenomenon that has largely escaped our attention. It's here in the lobbies and entrances of rental office buildings across the city that abstract murals will find some of their best support in the mid-1950s and beyond. And it's support that extends to a variety of abstract styles, from abstract expressionism to highly geometric work. We've overlooked this phenomenon in part because our studies of art and architecture have tended to focus on corporate headquarters. During this period, iconic towers like Seagram or Lever House or Chase Manhattan Bank, designed by well-known architects as statements of corporate identity. The function and the economics of such edifices are very different from the rental office buildings I've been discussing thus far, and their ground level structures reflect that. Rising up as relatively slender towers on their plots, such buildings prefer to mark their entryways with large plazas or courtyards, and sometimes with further 3-dimensional elements like gardens, sculpture, or fountains. Abstract murals, 2-dimensional, often fairly detailed, and hard to take in at a single glance, were not nearly as effective at conjuring up visions of a civic arena gifted to the public by the corporation. Nor did they pack the punch of 3-dimensional sculpture, which could elaborate complex poetic dialogues with the standing forms and voids of building and plaza. What abstract murals were good at, however, was marking entryways and ground floor congregation points without taking up leasable floor space, turning relatively pedestrian facades and lobbies into more eye-catching versions. So for a structure like 2 Broadway, which was geared toward using space to charge rent, rather than using space to articulate prestige or corporate identity, the abstract mural was particularly attractive. And Katz's essay on Krasner points us towards another potential reason for this trend, a confluence between the visual language of abstract art and the processes of speculative real estate, or at any rate, toward their shared modern values of dynamism, volatility, and abstraction. Let's return in closing to Krasner's mural, because despite this trend in mural commissions, and despite the shared values that Katz astutely brings out, I don't believe we can fully reduce the mural at 2 Broadway to just a potent metaphor for speculative real estate, for the dynamism of capitalism at this moment. There is something about the mural's stony, fragmented surface that stops and slows the passerby and pulls her into a different mode of viewing. 2 Broadway, the building, may be, in Katz's phrasing, a menacing presence, outrageously indifferent to how it presents itself to viewers and occupies its site. But the mosaic, for all its problems of placement and height, for all the difficulties in seeing it under certain lighting conditions, and for all its non-referential abstract vocabulary, still offers an exercise in slow, absorptive perusal, evoking thematic links with nature, time, and history. Ultimately, I think it is B.H. Friedman's vision of Krasner's mural that is most illuminating, but perhaps not for the reasons he intends. Friedman's reading is the most typical of the period in its invocation of the humanizing effect of abstract art on modern office life. But it is also the most revealing of the limitations of that perspective. In his desire to have the Manhattan mosaic relieve and humanize the structure, Friedman essentially reassigns architectural meaning at large. The entire work of communication, expression, legibility, the unfolding of spatial and temporal concerns, to a thin ribbon of ornament sitting above the entrance. This is where public address can now happen, Friedman suggests. This is where, in a building with very little interest in speaking publicly to its occupants or passersby, some form of public address might still happen. But this is a greatly reduced framework in which abstract muralism can operate, especially when we compare it with the abstract murals of the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s, the earlier part of that larger trajectory that I mentioned at the outset. For earlier painters, abstract muralism was a deeply utopian project. It aimed at nothing less than the transformation through color, form, and space of the world we live in, with the human viewer at its center. And I mean this rhetorically in terms of the claims made for the murals, but also spatially and architecturally in terms of how these earlier murals related to their sites. This change in attitude is emblematic of a broader change in late modernism. As the 50s wore on, abstract painters and many art and architecture critics wrote with a spirit of resignation or cynicism as they chronicled the changing face of the city and art's role within it. Abstract murals increasingly appear to them as a series of contrasts between what the building failed to offer, identified variously as warmth, meaning, humanity, expression, and what the mural provided in reduced compensatory form. Even Friedman, the most ardent proponent of Krasner's mural, has no illusions that it will change 2 Broadway's overwhelming effect. The building, to quote his language once again, is rigid, austere, prefabricated, shiny, and massive. It is the work of the mural to relieve this, to add a small touch of freedom, variety, temporality, and humanity. But the humanization of the building at large, or the rededication of corporate life to human ends, is well beyond its purview. Modernism's utopian project is thus both reduced in scope and strangely heightened in its stakes, as the 1,000 square feet of Krasner's mural becomes the building's sole redemptive core. By the late 1950s, the promise of abstract muralism had both narrowed its ambit and deepened its effect. Abstraction would not transform the world, but it would preserve a vision of that transformation. It would not remake the viewer, but it would offer her a glimpse of the freedom and plenitude that such remakings had once promised. Thank you.